I'm just going to give a quick introduction. We started a little bit late, had some technical issues. So I'm just going to give you the lay of the land a little bit before we then listen to the status updates of the different working groups for today. So first of all, welcome to the SETAC North America. That's what the SNA stands for, SETAC North America Joint LCA Interest Group. I will talk about that a little bit more. Lisa and I have been chairing this for almost a couple of years by now. But we have other steering committee members that you see at the bottom. So we basically come together once a month and discuss the topics of relevance. And let me start out by communicating this disclaimer. So the views expressed in these presentations that you will see today represent the opinions of the authors and shall not be misconstrued to represent or imply any endorsement by any of the affiliated organizations, including SETAC and ACLCA. Now to the background of these working groups, a brief history of how we got here. So SETAC North America, the LCA Interest Group, was established about 25 years ago. ACLCA, the American Center of Life Cycle Assessment, was founded about 20 years ago. So they were happily existing in parallel with each other. But then in 2019, Lisa had the great idea that maybe those two organizations could work together to avoid redundancy. So in 2019, the two organizations signed a MOU, and we decided to form the Joint Interest Group on LCA between SETAC and ACLCA. And specifically, this group functions as ACLCA's technical committee to work on more methodological topics. In 2020, we then put out a call for volunteers for working groups on different topics that were prioritized by the interest group steering committee. And then finally, in Q4 of 2020 and Q1 of 2021, 8 working groups in total started their work. And today is the second of recurring biannual status updates webinars. So twice a year, the working group conveners, chairs, co-chairs, so to speak, will give a brief overview of where the working groups are. We record it. We put it into ACLCA's YouTube channel, and then it will be there for all time. Before we start with the updates, just remember that these working groups are still open for volunteers. So if you would like to join the fun, then you can just contact the working group chairs. And here, an overview of those 8 working groups. And today, we're going to hear from 4 of these, and then we have a part 2 webinar scheduled for later in the month. All right, that's it for my side. So I was a little bit late because I couldn't find the link. Did you guys discuss who was going to go first?
Yeah, I think I'm going to start with the interest group on circularity and life cycle assessments. If that's
perfect.
Yeah, so I'm going.
That's fine by me. So you can. I will stop sharing, and then you can.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah,
go ahead. I think it's not recording, by the way. My recording button is not blinking, so I think I will just hit that right now. Please ask the host to give you permission to record. Are you recording, Simon?
I am recording.
Oh, okay.
Chris,
okay.
So don't worry, I will share it after the meeting.
Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Could you just confirm that you are seeing my screen?
Yes, confirmed.
Perfect. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to give you an update about our progress on this working group on circularity life cycle assessment. So I'm Michael Saidani. I'm currently a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Illinois, and I'm co-leading this interest group with Ashley Crowder, which is a sustainability consultant at Trumbull. So in our working group, we have good numbers, like 10 active members contributing on a monthly basis on the different tasks and action items we are going to present in the next slide, and also a number of participants that are more here to be aware of what we are doing, and they are this observing role. And as Christophe mentioned, we are still open to welcome new volunteers, specifically if you are from industry and have specific product, process, or system you want to experiment circularity indicators and life cycle assessment in order to kind of put into practice the pain points we have identified and to see how we can go hand in hand with circularity assessment and life cycle assessment. So here is a quick reminder of what motivates actually this building this interest group, ACLCA SETAC Joint Working Group. So it is more and more acknowledged that moving towards circular economy practices will ultimately lead to economic, social, and environmental benefits, and specifically integrating circular design principles as early as possible in the design and development phase of the production of new products could reduce significantly the environmental footprint. But there is recently this need, both for industry, companies, businesses, to have more easy to use tools and methods to design for circularity. And that's not that straightforward, because what circular economy means for one could be different to another. There is plenty of different facets of what a circular economy is. So from an LCA scope and system boundaries, not that straightforward to assess and monitor the circularity performance of different potential end-of-life options and circular economy loops. So we wanted to kind of provide clarity on the potential link and utility between life cycle assessment and circularity indicators. So in a couple of sentences, which kind of issues we are trying to provide new insights or new answers on is to clarify the complementarity difference between LCA-based indicators and circular economy metrics among this kind of huge pool inventory of such indicator available. To also study the correlation, the link, the relationship between the performance from a circular point of view and from an LCA point of view, and then to facilitate the environmental impact assessment of different circular economy options using LCA. For example, what if this product or particular components has 2-3 life cycle? What if we have different pathways at the end of life between reuse, remanufacturing, refurbishing, material recovery? That's according to the ISO standards. It's not super, they do not provide that much or clear guidance on how to do that. So we want to clarify these aspects. So to do so, among our 10 to 12 active members, we divided this kind of ambitious goal within 4 sub-working groups. Sub-working group number 1 is dedicated to identify, make this inventory, the current state of the art of circularity indicators and LCA-based indicators available out there, and to more than that, to also see which one are the most used, for example, the one from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the one from other organizations and companies that are gaining traction, and to see if they're actually implemented in industrial reality. The working group number 2, to see, knowing that we have all these circularity indicators and tools available, how can we evaluate circular economy loops performance through life cycle analysis? So we'll have I have a first slide to show their progress on this sub-working group number 2. And sub-working group number 3 is dedicated to discuss, analyze the potential trade-offs that could occur when some companies want to reach circularity goals. Is it compatible? Is it well aligned to their sustainability and decrease of environmental performance? And they're reviewing existing literature, existing studies, reports that are combining both circularity assessment and sustainability assessment. I'll show you a rapid table to summarize our findings as well. And the last group that is still a lot of work ongoing is to kind of combine all of this together to actually facilitate the evaluation of circular economy or end-of-life option in life cycle assessment through concrete real-world industrial cases. So some first contribution we had in the past few weeks or months. So for example, sub-working group number 2, in order to see and to facilitate how we can evaluate circular economy end-of-life option using LCA, we, within our working group, included researchers from academia, university, and also practitioners from industry. We've been kind of collecting the key pain points we are facing when we want to do a life cycle assessment on circular products using the 4 steps of the ISO 14040, 14044 standards. So some pain points or obstacles, hindrance we face when in the goal and scope of all the life cycle inventory, life cycle impact assessment, step 3, and interpretation. For example, the end of life allocation approach, there are different approaches. So it's not that easy to know which one fits the best to a specific context product. So we'll be working and discussing to provide further recommendation on that. Also related to the data availability of the potential impact savings from recycling or second-hand materials. So that's plenty of little points here and there that are kind of we are facing to properly assess the circularity performance through multiple life of products. And one extract of another contribution we had from working group number 3, analyzing the trade-offs between circularity and LCA indicators. They've been reviewing 6 case studies, and here is just one discussing the potential alignment or mismatch sometimes between circularity indicators and LCA-based or sustainability-based indicators. So all of these findings will be hopefully available to all the community soon, because we are planning to submit our first findings in a position paper for the International Journal of Life Cycle Assessment. We are at the very end of it, so it will be submitted next week. So the goal is to communicate further about our interest group, to outreach wider, not only in the SETAC ACLCA community, and to also get feedback validation from the scientific community. And that could be a way for further work also to connect with other groups, also tackling this issue. For example, the ISO technical committee, ISO TC 323, that is working on measuring circularity performance. And in early 2022, once we'll be done with this initial contribution, we'll try to discuss and provide solution for the key pain points that we identified through our heuristic map, and also continue looking and applying circularity indicators and life cycle assessment on at least one real-world case study. So I think that was pretty all for our updates, and do not hesitate if you have any suggestion, question, or remarks. And thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you very much. I asked people to type their questions into the chat. I don't see any right now, so maybe we can come back to your presentation if there are questions at a later point. In the interest, yeah, in the interest of time, I think we should then move on to the next presentation. We can see the presenter mode right now. You got to switch displays.
Okay. Yep. How does that look?
That's it. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Cashman. I'll be giving you a short update on our working group, which is looking at the intersection of life cycle assessment and indirect greenhouse gas emissions accounting. We have 8 members in our working group. So Ashley Kruder is co-chairing with me. And then we have a mix of folks from primarily consulting, but also industry and academia on our working group. We started in January of this year, but we're certainly open to welcoming new members, even if it's just to give feedback or to review some of our material. A reminder about the scope of our working group. We're looking at inclusion of indirect or supply chain emissions in quantifying organizational and community greenhouse gas emissions, and including LCA as sort of a tool within sort of supply chain emissions accounting. And this is increasingly important as companies and also organizations or communities try to pursue climate targets and include indirect emissions, which can be challenging to quantify. So in terms of the problems and needs that are going forward, that our working group aims to address is we're looking to review LCA methods and data types for indirect emissions accounting to sort of serve as a guiding resource, not necessarily exhaustive, but something that can help the community and also highlight the importance of LCA in indirect GHG emissions accounting. And then, we'll also use this as a tool to help non-LCA practitioners kind of alleviate some of the perceived level of effort to quantify indirect, or sometimes called scope 3 GHG emissions when they're working on their internal accounting. In terms of the specific tasks, our working group meets about once per month. We started out basically developing and populating a matrix to track methods and tools and data sets for GHG accounting for scope 3 or indirect GHG emissions using LCA type methods. We've developed 2 surveys that we've distributed. One survey that just went out earlier this week on ACLCA's LinkedIn page is open to the public and asking for information that the public can provide information on how they use life cycle methods in calculating organizational scope 3 GHG emissions. We've also developed a targeted survey for database providers, for example, for life cycle inventory database providers, to understand the scope and the characteristics associated with life cycle data that might be used for indirect GHG emissions accounting. And we've sent that just to specific database providers, but we welcome any database provider or data set developer to take the survey. I'll provide my contact information on a later slide if you're interested in taking this survey. We've also looked at a number of use cases. So for example, how specific corporations are using LCA and supplier data in their organizational accounting, different types of data. So if they're using process-based or environmentally extended or hybrid methods for their scope 3 accounting. One of our members also did a deep dive into the Science-Based Targets Initiative to understand how companies that are involved in that effort are including indirect GHG emissions, and if they have specific targets related to indirect emissions. And we're documenting all of these findings. We're planning to submit a draft journal article at the end of January. And we'll also be sort of identifying data gaps and next steps that are really needed from the LCA community, sort of in the context of this being an ACLCA SETAC initiative, to really help streamline and move the effort of including and highlighting LCA for GHG emissions accounting forward. And hopefully we'll also have the opportunity to present some of these findings at a conference at a later date. We distributed a database provider survey in September. As I previously mentioned, just a couple items that we specifically requested database providers provide some input on. This is a short survey, only about 5 minutes. So again, if you're a database provider, we welcome additional feedback. But in terms of the questions we asked, in terms of your database, what's the timeline and how do you communicate updates essentially associated with new data or updated data within your database? What's the license for your database? Is it open access? Is it some type of subscription program? What is the geographic coverage? Our working group While we've looked kind of at global sources, we have focused more on North American sources as well, given the scope of this working group. What is the intended user base of the specific database? What is the type of data? As I mentioned, oftentimes different types of data. For example, environmentally extended input-output data may be used for sort of broad commodities or sectors in your supply chain emissions, but maybe if you produce specific products, you may also do detailed process modeling, which would really be a place for LCA to come into play as well. What are the life cycle stages covered, as well as what are the global warming potentials? For example, are they 100-year time horizon or 20 years, and what sort of IPCC assessment report factors are they? And do you recommend your database for scope 3 accounting, or is it really more of a looking at a broader suite of LCA metrics that is more appropriate for your database? So again, if you're a database or provider or data set developer and would like to participate in the survey, please just email me. Here's my email address, and we can send along the survey to you. We also sent out a Scope 3 survey to the public. It's posted on ACLCA's LinkedIn page. Here's the link as well. This again is a short survey, but we're trying to get a sense both from organizations that do develop indirect emissions accounting and Scope 3 results, but also for developers of the data. Really, if you're involved in Scope 3 accounting in any way, we'd be interested for you to take this survey. And we've just asked some really basic questions about the type and size of your organization, how you're involved in Scope 3 accounting. Do you publicly report your emissions and related to your Scope 3 emissions? We've asked some questions about data collection, and if you're using life cycle methods in Scope 3 reporting, and so forth. So, for example, do you engage your supply chain? So again, we welcome you to take this survey. We'd love to get additional responses. As I mentioned, our working group also looked at existing data sets, standards, peer-reviewed literature. So here's just an example of us when we were initially identifying sources. We developed this matrix where we listed our search method, our data type, the name of our source, the data publication, and so forth. And then as we continued to kind of iterate on the sources to include in our assessment, we recorded additional information such as the geographic coverage, the life cycle stages covered, the Scope 3 category, for example, purchased goods and services, which is one category where LCA often comes into play, but maybe also end-of-life treatment, or business travel, other types of categories LCA may be relevant when it comes to indirect emissions. What type of life cycle modeling approach was used and what type of environmental metrics were assessed, as well as I mentioned before, the GWP factors used, the basis, if it was sort of a product assessment or on an organizational basis, what is the intended audience, and then a sort of a summary of each data source reviewed. We've also been looking at specific use cases where individual companies may report that, for example, 70% of their organizational GHG emissions might be associated with their supply chain or something similar. And one example of this, one of our members looked at the Science-Based Target Initiative and sort of mined that open database to see sort of what sectors were reporting specific targets. And then within those sectors, which ones were not addressing Scope 3 and which ones were. And you can see here, you see the sectors on the bottom here, and the darker color here shows Scope 3 instances where Scope 3 emissions were not addressed in their target. So of sort of the 173 US-based companies with science-based targets that we identified, we saw that almost, the majority, 164 companies were addressing Scope 3 or something similar like supplier GHG emissions in their results. So as I mentioned, our next step is to try to submit a draft journal article by the end of January. We're targeting the special issue of the International Journal of Life Cycle Assessment, which is looking at life cycle assessment in the context of decarbonization and carbon neutrality. It's an interesting special issue. I think, there's a lot of interest in the field and the subject at the moment. So I sort of recommend looking at the contributions to date as well in this special issue. And that's it for now. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you. We had two questions in the chat. One from Lisa. Do you get confusion with other indirect definitions, like indirect land use change, for example?
That's a good question. The one point we included indirect, so we could also look at sort of purchased electricity, but there's other working groups focused on electricity, so it hasn't necessarily been a target for us, but that's why we went with sort of indirect in addition to sort of the scope 3 GHG protocol.
And that's also the language that the ISO standards use, right? So instead of speaking of scope 1 to 3, they speak of direct and indirect emissions, right? And the second question is, when will the survey results be available for public view? I think the answer is the journal paper you plan, right?
Yes, that's right.
So that can still take a little while.
Yes.
All right, great, thank you. Who wants to go next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ray Smith. Wanted to show my face here because I have some notes and I am going to be referring to them. So I'm not going to show my face anymore, but you can hear my voice, I hope.
Yes.
Thank you. My work group area is new technologies for LCA. And I'd like to make clear that that's different than doing life cycle assessment of new technologies, right? That's very different. So the idea is what can new technologies do for LCA? So this work group, we started out with roughly 24 members, and those members proposed ideas, and the ideas were grouped into 3 large areas. So I essentially formed subgroups of those in those areas. So one subgroup on impact assessment and interpretation. So that actually does not currently, it's not being worked on, right? So that's an opportunity, especially if right, you cannot see my screen because I don't have any slides. So impact assessment is not something that's currently being worked on. There are 2 other subgroups, however, that do exist. So I'm going to talk about those in a little bit more detail. So the first subgroup is called inventory, uncertainty, and representativeness. Excuse me. There are 8 team members on this subgroup. And the leader of the subgroup is Qingxi Tu. So Qingxi is at the University of British Columbia. So he's leading this group of 8 people. The areas that the group has gone into is they've looked at course background materials on types of uncertainty and uncertainty methods. Have gone into the pedigree matrix and what are the alternatives to that matrix to look at uncertainty. Whether Monte Carlo methods and other simulations are a good approach. A lot on sampling. We have an expert on sampling methods in uncertainty, and we'll likely actually have to decide where to focus that information. And then finally, in the future, we're perhaps going to be looking at the probability approaches for the likelihood of certain scenarios and looking at that as an approach. So those are the areas where this group is focused. It meets roughly every other week. That's when the meetings are planned. Everyone has busy schedules, and so not every meeting is as fruitful as maybe producing a lot. But we are a tight group with 8 members, and we break into subtasks to get focus to get things done. The other subgroup that is working is called inventory availability. So this actually this subgroup also has 8 team members in the subgroup, and the leader of the subgroup is Mark Imba Wright. So Mark is at Iowa State University, and this group is focusing, it's of course background material on the availability of inventory, but then thinking about data gaps, and you want to fill how do we fill these? And one of the important aspects we think is looking at the structure of data for both its use and interoperability between platforms. And then finally, on the generation of life cycle inventory. So whether machine learning methods are the way to go, whether there are other technologies, different sorts of models. And then in terms of a physical technology that we thought of is that whether new sensors could get measured data that would be useful for life cycle inventory. And so the availability of that measured data for LCA. So those are brief descriptions of these subgroups. The work is continuing and is we've got a good group of people, but as others have mentioned, we're open to others joining us. And whether you want to work on impact assessment and interpretation, uncertainty or availability of data, we would welcome input. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. A follow-up question from my side. I think originally we also talked about blockchain usage for, basically tracing supply chain for individual companies. Is blockchain still on your list?
We have not focused on blockchain. We've discussed blockchain, and I would certainly be open to people coming in and describing or working on how blockchain could be used as a new technology for inventory or impact assessment in LCA. It's interesting. It's of course an accounting method, right, for keeping track of things. The value added needs to be there. But yeah, we're certainly open to that.
Okay, and you're also still open for new members, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. We will not distribute slides. We will really just post the recordings. ACLCA will do some editing and split them up into individual ones, I think. And then it will be available online. Thanks everybody for joining today and for giving us a status update, and then we'll continue the work. Thanks a lot.